America cannot have a war with Iran, by the way. It would lead to a regional war. It would be costly, bloody, threatening.
So recently, Jeffrey Sachs was on Tucker Carlson's podcast talking about the looming threat of U.S. war with Iran, who he thinks is behind it, why it's part of a larger string of foreign policy disasters, and what he thinks the consequences would be of it. So let's watch and let's react. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel.
And the last country on that list, as you said at the outset, is Iran.
That's it.
We were hearing this week that Iran is just weeks away from building a nuclear weapon. And so we need to take out the nuclear sites. We need to effect regime change in Iran. I feel like I've been hearing that Iran is weeks away from a nuclear weapon for at least 25 years.
Yes, at verbatim at least a decade, and for longer in substance, yes.
Is Iran weeks away from building a nuclear weapon? Does Iran want a nuclear weapon? Will Iran get a nuclear weapon? What is the truth about Iran?
Iran does not want a nuclear weapon. Iran's neighbors, like the Saudis and others in the Gulf, do not want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Iran's major ally, Russia, does not want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon. But Iran does not want to be defeated militarily by Israel, does not want to be bombed to hell by Israel, and does not want to be sanctioned to death economically by the United States, which the U.S. has been doing now for endless years. So Iran has said for 10 years, 11 years, 12 years, unequivocally, we don't want a nuclear weapon. We want an agreement with you. We want you to lift sanctions, and we want a no nuclear system, and with all verifications and monitoring and safety as well.
Yeah, and the record indicates that that is what exactly they have done, or at least their actions have followed, because they showed their compliance and adherence to that doctrine when they signed the joint agreement with Obama. It was one of the only great things I think Obama did, especially in terms of foreign policy. And Trump got out of that agreement, right? And it would have allowed for more inspections and, you know, showing the West that we don't have a nuclear weapon. Because look, they want nuclear power, as all countries should. Nuclear power is cheaper than a lot of other types of power and much more beneficial. And you'd think a lot of the climate change brigade would be behind it because, you know, it's safer than emitting CO2s into the atmosphere, at least under those doctrines, right? So Sachs is right here. The U.S. has antagonized Iran way too long, and it has been like 25 years. We've heard time after time that they're weeks away from a nuclear weapon. They just might as well be honest and say, you know, they're -7 days away from a nuclear weapon. We all know it's lies. It has been for so long.
We want to have our nuclear power plants. We want our own military. We're not going to disarm in a region where Israel attacks every country in the region. And by the way, where we have other enemies as well. So we are not going to unilaterally disarm in our region, but we do not want a nuclear weapon. The truth is that has been known for a dozen years in detail at the highest levels. And
so what's the problem? That seems like a pretty good basis for an agreement.
The problem, there is no problem in reaching a sound agreement. And by the way, with the nuclear power plants, which are in dozens of countries, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has successfully monitored and set up absolutely rigorous monitoring, and Iran is open to that and has said so repeatedly, and has said it would work with the neighbors on the fuel supply chains and all the rest. There is no obstacle to this.
I want to correct him on that. One way in which I might differ from Sachs is that there is an obstacle, and it's the Israel lobby. It's the Zionists and Likud party and Netanyahu supporters that want there to be regime change in Iran. He's called for it openly. He says what he wants is the Libyan model to be applied to Iran. Well, what's that? It's regime change. And then in Libya's case, there's open slave trading there now, right? Because this actually serves to be a threat to Netanyahu. If you take off the table the pretense for regime change in Iran through a joint agreement between the U.S. and Iran to curtail its nuclear weapons program, or what is supposedly a nuclear weapons program, to allow for inspections, then all the neocons and, pro-Israel supporters lose the pretense for occupation of Iran or regime change in Iran. And that's what Netanyahu has called for over 20 years. He appeared, as a so-called expert in congressional testimony saying as much. So that is the major obstacle to this kind of deal.
And I think we're close to an agreement with Iran, in fact, thanks to President Trump, because Netanyahu says, no, we need to bomb the hell out of them. We need to defeat them like we defeated Saddam and Assad and Gaddafi. We need to take out this evil regime. That's his line.
So it's not about nukes, what you're saying. You're saying it's not about nukes, it's about regime change.
I think for sure. And that's been true all along.
Iran, so why not just say that? Why lie? Why does Fox News tell me every single, not that I have a TV, but I hear Fox News is telling everyone every day they're moments away from a nuclear. We cannot allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Day after day after day. Why not just say no?
I think, by the way, that's true. And Iran would agree with that. Okay? Yes, that's what we're saying.
So, but if you went on television right now, if you were back on your old perch on Morning Joe and you said, actually, Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon, they would accuse you immediately of being an agent of Iran.
They might.
They would call him pro-Ayatollah, just like they call him pro-Hamas because he doesn't want to fund Israel's war path in Gaza. This is what we get all the time. They've always wanted regime change there. It's not different now. And if they didn't, they wouldn't have brought that up after Obama, signed that deal with Iran to curtail its supposed nuclear weapons program. But the rallies for regime change continued after that. Iran was the last country on what was the clean break strategy. Remember, Wesley Clark went to the Pentagon in the weeks after 9/11 and was exposed to plans saying that there was going to be regime change in 7 countries in 5 years. Now, it's been more than 5 years, but the only country in which there hasn't been regime change since that time is, what do you know, Iran. The same entity, the same state that the CIA wants the U.S. going to war with, that the Israel lobby wants us to go to war with, and that Netanyahu wants us to go to war with for regime change.
Because maybe someone would tell them in their little earpiece to say that, because that's how it works.
But you're saying that's true. I mean, you're acting like that's like a non-controversial statement. No, Iran doesn't want to bomb. They've said they don't. They just don't want to get attacked.
They have said for years, remove our sanctions, normalize relations, stop trying to overthrow us, tell your bulldog Israel to stop threatening us with war, and we can have perfectly normal relations, and we don't want a nuclear weapon. It's a much bigger headache than we want. We don't want it.
Boy, that is not the story that any American news channel tells ever.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, shocking. That American news media, that the corporate media would say something that disincentivizes war. We know that the corporate media, whether it's the right-wing corporate media or the left-wing corporate media, is always selling the latest wars. That started to be the case on the left once Obama was sworn into office. They no longer talked about non-intervention. They went straight to Syria, straight to Libya, got involved in Ukraine, and, expanded the drone war in the Middle East. It's all you get with the establishment. It's the military-industrial complex profiting on these wars over time, these prolonged wars that aren't designed to be won. They're designed to stretch far and produce a lot of money for Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and the Northrop Grummans of the world.
We live in the world of narratives. For many years, for many years, the Iranians were asking, how do we reach the Biden White House? How do we want to open up channels? We want to negotiate. Of course, they wouldn't talk to them. It was, we know the president now, we knew then, but now it's confirmed. The president wasn't in any shape to talk to anybody. And the administration was the biggest foreign policy failure of one can imagine.
Yeah, not even in shape to talk to his dog.
But the Iranians have been saying all along, we want to negotiate. And as soon as President Trump was elected, at least I got inquiries. Do you know anyone in the White House? Do you know anyone in the president's team? How can we make contact? That's not the behavior you make if you're relentlessly trying to go to a nuclear bomb.
So what about the story that you hear endlessly that Iran is planning to nuke the United States, that that's on their agenda?
Huh?
Yeah, right.
Huh?
So you consider that like insane?
I consider that so bewildering. If a grown-up says that, we need to have a long heart-to-heart talk about a lot of facts. But that is simply the most absurd imaginable idea. Iran, by the way, is a civilization of, by usual count, 5,200 years. Persia is the usual name given
oldest
for
continuous in the world.
Iran. Yes, it's arguably the longest continuous civilization, though many jump up and say, no, we are. Maybe the Georgians say it or the Egyptians say it. So I won't get into arguments among my friends, except this is actually a great civilization that has lasted for 5,000 years. They're not going to bring it to an end by bombing the United States and having Persia or Iran disappear from the world map, literally, physically, by atom, by such an attack. So it's not.
So why are we going?
And yeah, actually, Iran was pretty pro-Western at one point, too. That is until the CIA regime changed it in 53 or 54, I can't remember which. And there was an Iranian regime that was supposedly going to be, much more interested in the affairs of America and more closely aligned with American foreign policy and American values. Well, we saw what happened. Fundamentalists rose up, overthrew that government in 79, and then we had the Ayatollahs in power. That is the fruits of regime change. It never goes as planned. It's always bloody. It's always costly, and it's always catastrophic. That's why Dave Smith is right whenever he says, you know who America's enemies will be? Those we're funding right now. Those will be America's enemies.
Going through all this, the full attention of huge parts of the U.S. government, billions and billions and billions and trillions over the years of American tax dollars have gone to responding to this threat. We have bases all around the region, all focused on Iran, which we maintain, including a huge one in Qatar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this effort by the United States focused on this Iranian threat that you claim doesn't exist.
Remember that Iran was first of all, Iran was a democratic country in 1953. Mm-hmm. The prime minister at the time, named Mossadegh, had this absolutely outlandish idea, which was that the oil under their ground belonged to Iranians. This was a very weird idea because the British knew it belonged to the British. The Americans expected that it belonged to the Americans in the new age. And so CIA and MI6 overthrew the Iranian democracy. Then we installed a police state known as the Shah of Iran and SAVAK, its supposed intelligence and enforcement authority from 1953 to 1978, when the Shah was dying of cancer, and he was a hated figure in Iran. Jimmy Carter was talked into taking him into into the United States, and that provoked the reaction and the taking of hostages of American hostages in Iran.
And such is the tales of all sorts of regime change operations from the past where the U.S. says, hey, let's just install this guy that's closer to our interests, closer aligned to us. Well, they don't even consider that that will provoke a reactionary element within that state, often which overthrows it or becomes the enemy of the U.S. in the future. Another example is, the people that were being funded by the CIA through the ISI in Pakistani intelligence in Afghanistan, where you had the Mujahideen receiving arms from the US and Pakistan to fight against the Soviets. Well, many of those fighters became terrorists and Al-Qaeda, essentially, and they became the enemies of the US. So this happens time and time again throughout US history.
And the Iranian Revolution was taken badly by the United States, but Iran had been our fortress. And why Iran? Because this was part of our anti-Soviet effort. Right. This was part of our Cold War effort. So Iran turned from police state ally to America's foe and Israel's foe. And by the way, in 1980, the United States and 1981 in particular, the United States armed Saddam Hussein massively to go kill Iranians. So
there's another great example. The U.S. intervened militarily on behalf of the Iraqis in the Iraq-Iran war at one point. You had, there's a famous picture out there of Donald Rumsfeld shaking the hand of Saddam Hussein because they had pleasant diplomatic relations. Well, the U.S. funneled arms and resources to Iraq only to have Saddam become its enemy later. It always is costly. It's always fruitless. Nothing would stop Iran from being another fruitless affair if a regime change operation is pulled off there.
We told Iraq, go invade Iran. And we supported an absolutely bloody, disastrous war between Iraq and Iran. We loved it. It was the two scorpions fighting in the bottle, killing each other.
Fought in part by children.
On American... on the American dime. So our position towards Iran has been an aggression since 1953, actually. Remember, the American deep state doesn't care about any other people at all, whatever happens to them. It doesn't care about the Ukrainian people. It doesn't care about the people we're, quote, saving. It cares about whatever fight it's in. The fight might be against Russia, in which case the Ukrainians are used. The fight might be for Israel, in which case some other jihadists are used, whatever.
Or the Kurds.
The Kurds or whoever is convenient at the time.
Another example is whenever Lindsey Graham says that money spent on funding the war in Ukraine on the side of the Ukrainians is the best money ever spent because it's not U.S. soldiers directly in the line of battle. Well, the same rotten fruits come spilling from that theater too. We're $200 billion in debt from that war. I should say it's costed $200 billion, with no sense that peace will come soon, with no peace agreement, with no prospect that the Ukrainians can actually win. As Zelensky sets up his own police state, has enacted martial law, outlawed political opposition, shut down adversarial newspapers, and tried to expand their conscription laws. So you have old men being pulled off the streets, away from their families for this bloody affair that the U.S. should have no part in. Just another example here.
So Iran is kind of amazingly incurring this for 75 years and for the last dozen years saying, peace, come on, make peace. President Trump is close to it right now. Again, as in all the other cases we have been discussing, the deep state narrative is deep. It's long-standing. It's not shallow. It's pretty much empty. It's pretty much concocted, but it's deep. And so in order to overcome the deep state, in this case, it's the Israel or Zionist lobby because it's got a pretty complicated domestic heritage and base. In order to overcome what has been 20 years of wars of choice in the Middle East and to stop them, it requires a lot of political capital and attention by President Trump. Just like in Ukraine, he's absolutely on the right track. But he's getting attacked by everybody for being on the right track. And he's trying to express America's real interest. America cannot have a war with Iran, by the way. It would lead to a regional war. It would be costly, bloody, threatening. And on January 17th of this year, Iran signed a security agreement with Russia. So it would just open up another front of potential nuclear war.
Yeah, absolutely. The prospect of war with Iran would be the worst thing to befall this administration, and there's been a lot of serious issues here when it comes to bombing Yemen and, not being serious about Doge, dragging supporters of Doge cuts and people that actually wanted to carve up the giant Pentagon budget that was offered, the $1 trillion Pentagon budget that was boasted about by Pete Hegseth, like Thomas Massie and Rand Paul, that actually believe in cutting government. Trump decided to drag those people, not releasing the Epstein files. There've been a lot, but Trump can correct some of those things to an extent if he resists the urges to go to war with Iran. This could be Trump's shining moment, like I think his best moment in his first term was, and that was normalizing relations with North Korea. Some of that soured because North Korean troops are fighting on the side of Russia in the Russian-Ukraine war at some point. But I do believe that did a big service to America because we're not really saber-rattling with North Korea anymore. It can be that way with Iran too, but you can't allow the Israel lobby to control things and Netanyahu to control our foreign policy, as it seems to have happened so many times before. What with the war in Syria, the war in Iraq, the war in Libya, all of which were theaters that Netanyahu supported those wars. We can get away from that now. No more war. This is the time to embrace non-intervention. We can't take it. We're too far in debt, $36 trillion in debt. I think it's close to 37 at this point. We just can't sustain it. And it's just so odious. Every single time, it never pays off. It never pays dividends. So Sachs is on the right track here. He's totally right. He's a little bit more charitable toward Trump than I would be, especially because status quo policy hasn't really changed much, especially in Ukraine. And now in Israel, it's about the same as it was prior to the ceasefire too. But we'll have to see. There's looming threats of a war with Iran that U.S. could strike at any time. Sure hoping that doesn't happen, but let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think that war with Iran will happen, or will it be averted? I do want to hear from you on that. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.